Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Holden had spent years hiding behind the walls of guilt and silence, burying truths that could shatter entire legacies. But on that cold, stormy evening at Newman Enterprises, when lightning cracked through the glass windows and thunder rolled like an omen, he finally broke. The truth, so heavy, so devastating, could no longer stay buried. Victor Newman, the powerful patriarch who built an empire on control, manipulation, and secrets, stood before Holden with that familiar icy stare, demanding answers. Mitch, unaware that his whole life was about to be rewritten, stood just behind him, confused and tense. Holden's voice trembled as he began to speak, each word dragging out years of concealed torment. "Victor," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of what he was about to confess, "you're not just Mitch's mentor, you're his father." The room fell silent. The air thickened with disbelief, anger, and raw emotion. Victor's eyes narrowed, part disbelief, part fury, while Mitch's jaw dropped as if the ground beneath him had just crumbled. For years, Victor had believed he'd buried his past so deep that no one could dig it up. But Holden had been there from the beginning. He had seen everything, the secret affair, the desperate decisions, the lies that were told to protect reputations and power. Holden's confession poured out like a confession he'd rehearsed for decades but never dared to say. He revealed that decades ago, when Victor was younger, before his empire had fully solidified, he'd had a brief, passionate affair with a woman named Margaret, the same woman who later gave birth to Mitch. Margaret, scared and alone, had turned to Holden for help when Victor refused to acknowledge the child. Holden, who worked for Victor at the time, had been ordered to handle the situation quietly. And he did, by arranging for Margaret to disappear from Genoa City and start a new life elsewhere, under the promise that her son would never know the truth about his father. But Margaret died young, and Mitch grew up believing that Holden was the one who had helped him out of kindness, never knowing that Holden carried the guilt of being the man who separated him from his real father. Every time Mitch rose in the business world, every time Victor praised him for his brilliance and loyalty, Holden's guilt ate away at him a little more. It was poetic cruelty. Victor had unknowingly raised his own son's rival, admired his own flesh and blood without realizing it. And now, the truth was out. Mitch's voice cracked as he shouted, "You're lying," but there was something in Holden's tone that made denial impossible. Victor's face hardened, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear, a rare, almost human vulnerability. "Holden," he said slowly, his voice dangerously calm, "you'd better explain every damn detail before I destroy what's left of your life." Holden's hand shook as he handed over an old folder, weathered, creased, and sealed with the dust of decades. Inside were letters, Margaret's letters, confessing her heartbreak and naming Victor as Mitch's father. There was even a DNA report that Holden had kept hidden, proving the connection beyond any doubt. Mitch stumbled backward, his mind reeling. The man he had idolized, envied, fought against his entire life, was his father. "You," Mitch gasped, tears burning his eyes, "you knew, didn't you? You knew something, Victor. You always did." Victor didn't deny it right away. He simply stared at the papers, his silence louder than any denial could ever be. Holden went on, his voice heavy with regret. He explained how Victor had found out about Margaret's pregnancy years later but chose to let Holden take care of it to avoid scandal. Victor had his empire to protect, and a secret child would have been a liability. But Holden hadn't expected to grow attached to the boy he was supposed to erase from Victor's story. Mitch reminded him of the humanity Victor had long since buried, and Holden found himself unable to follow through with Victor's cold command. Instead, he kept watch from a distance, ensuring Mitch had every opportunity in life. And when Mitch finally entered Genoa City years later, ambitious and talented, Holden realized fate had brought him back to his rightful bloodline without even knowing it. But Holden's guilt had grown unbearable when he saw Victor and Mitch at odds, when he saw a father and son at war without even knowing they were family. That was the final straw. He couldn't carry the burden anymore. "I thought I was protecting everyone," Holden said, tears glistening in his eyes. but all I did was destroy lives." Mitch turned away, his hands gripping the edge of Victor's desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. The walls of his identity were collapsing around him. He thought back to every meeting, every harsh word, every moment Victor had dismissed him as just another pawn. How many times had he tried to earn the respect of the very man who had given him life? The irony was unbearable. Victor, on the other hand, was struggling to maintain his composure. His whole life had been built on dominance and control, on bending people to his will. But this truth cut deeper than any corporate betrayal. The realization that he had abandoned his own blood haunted him instantly. "If what you're saying is true," Victor said quietly, his voice trembling beneath the surface, "then I've made the gravest mistake of my life." The room filled with silence again. Mitch finally turned to face Victor, anger flashing in his eyes. "A mistake?" he shouted. "You call walking away from your own son a mistake? You ruined lives because of your pride." Victor tried to reach out, but Mitch pulled back, his expression filled with pain and disbelief. Holden could barely stand the sight of what he had unleashed. His confession had torn open a wound that might never heal. But it was too late to take it back. The secret was out, and it would change everything. In the days that followed, the Newman Empire trembled. The revelation sent shockwaves through Genoa City. Everyone wanted answers, especially those closest to Victor. Nikki was furious, not because Victor had cheated decades ago, but because he had kept yet another monumental secret from everyone. She accused him of living in a web of deception so thick that not even he could see where the lies ended and the truth began. "You always think you can control everything," she said bitterly. "But this time, you've destroyed something you can't rebuild." Meanwhile, Mitch disappeared for days, trying to make sense of his new reality. Holden tried to reach him, but Mitch refused to listen. "You had decades to tell me the truth," Mitch said coldly. "Now it's just words. Too late for forgiveness." Victor, meanwhile, struggled with something he hadn't felt in years: remorse. He replayed every conversation with Mitch in his mind, realizing how often he had seen himself in the younger man's ambition and stubbornness. The resemblance had always been uncanny, now it made painful sense. He couldn't undo what he'd done, but for the first time, Victor Newman wanted redemption more than power. He tried to meet Mitch again, to explain, but Mitch wouldn't see him. The betrayal ran too deep. The bond between father and son, already tested by years of rivalry, now hung by a thread of resentment and shattered trust. Holden, ostracized and guilt-ridden, became the scapegoat of the entire scandal. Victor blamed him for meddling, for playing God with people's lives. But Holden refused to back down this time. "You can't destroy me for telling the truth," he said bitterly. "You destroyed yourself the day you told me to hide that child." It was the first time anyone had ever spoken to Victor like that without fear. Victor didn't respond, he couldn't. Because deep down, Holden was right. Victor had built his legacy on strength and control, but this time, truth had overpowered him. Eventually, a DNA test confirmed what Holden had said: Victor Newman was indeed Mitch's biological father. The revelation spread through the media, shaking the Newman brand and reputation. Investors panicked, the press swarmed, and old rivals like Jack Abbott saw it as an opportunity to strike. But amid the chaos, Victor wasn't thinking about business, he was thinking about the son he never knew he had. He stood alone in his office late one night, staring at an old photograph Holden had given him of Margaret holding a newborn baby. His hand trembled as he touched the image. "I should have been there," he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time in years. Meanwhile, Mitch found himself torn between rage and sorrow. For so long, he had defined himself by his independence, by his determination to make it without anyone's help. Now he had to face the truth that his greatest enemy was his own father. The emotional toll was unbearable. He thought of all the times Victor had dismissed his ideas, belittled his ambitions, sabotaged his rise. It wasn't just business, it was a father unknowingly trying to destroy his son. And now, the man he had despised was the one who gave him life. Holden, too, faced the consequences of his confession. Though he had finally unburdened himself, he lost everything: his job, his reputation, and the fragile trust of those around him. But despite the cost, he felt a strange sense of peace. The truth was finally out, and even though it had destroyed so much, it had also freed him from decades of torment. "Secrets are like poison," he told Nikki when she confronted him. "You can bury them, but they always find their way to the surface." As weeks passed, Victor and Mitch slowly began to face each other again, not as enemies, but as two broken men trying to understand the bond that fate had cruelly hidden from them. Their first real conversation after the revelation was quiet, raw, and full of unresolved pain. "I don't expect forgiveness," Victor said, his voice low. "But I want to know you. Not as a business associate. As my son." Mitch hesitated, his emotions warring inside him. Part of him wanted to walk away forever, to punish Victor the way he had been punished. But another part, a smaller, wounded part, longed for the father he never had. "You can't just erase years of lies," Mitch said, his voice trembling. "But maybe we can start somewhere." It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a beginning. Holden watched from afar, knowing his confession had set something powerful in motion. The truth had broken them, but it had also given them a chance at something real. For the first time in decades, Victor Newman was forced to face the consequences of his humanity. And Mitch, though still scarred, began to realize that his greatest strength wasn't his independence, but his capacity to forgive. In the end, Holden's revelation did what no corporate war or scandal ever could: it humbled Victor Newman. It made him face his past, his choices, and his heart. And though the road to healing would be long, one thing was clear: the truth had finally come home. Mitch was no longer just an employee or a rival, he was family. And that single truth, though born in pain, changed everything forever. The days that followed Holden's confession were like a haunting echo that refused to fade. Genoa City buzzed with gossip, the news of Victor Newman's secret son spreading like wildfire. Boardrooms, coffee shops, and even the Newman media studios were alive with speculation. How could the great Victor Newman, an icon of control and precision, have hidden a son for decades? And how could Mitch, the man who had built his reputation on resilience and independence, be that very son? Yet behind the public spectacle, the real damage was happening in private, in the raw, unspoken pain between Victor, Mitch, and Holden. Victor spent sleepless nights in his study at the ranch, the fireplace flickering against walls lined with portraits of his family. He stared at the faces: Nikki, Nick, Victoria, Adam, and now, in his mind's eye, he saw Mitch's among them. The thought filled him with both pride and shame. Mitch's strength, his determination, his defiance, all things Victor once despised in him, now felt like a cruel mirror of himself. But the past couldn't be undone. For the first time in his life, Victor Newman didn't have a plan, a strategy, or a way to fix what had been broken. Meanwhile, Mitch was drowning in anger and confusion. He locked himself away in his penthouse, shutting out calls from everyone, even his closest allies. The revelation had ripped open old wounds. Everything he thought he knew about his past was a lie. Holden, the man he had trusted as a mentor, had been complicit in the deception. And Victor, the man he had competed with and despised for years, was his father. "What kind of world is this?" he muttered to himself one night, "where the man who abandoned me gets to call me son?" The bitterness ran deep. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the shadow of the man he swore he'd never become. Holden, on the other hand, was a ghost of himself. The confession had cost him everything: his career, his friendships, his peace. But in his heart, he believed it was the right thing to do. He spent his days wandering the outskirts of town, lost in thought, sometimes stopping by Margaret's grave to speak to her memory. "I told them," he whispered one afternoon, kneeling before the headstone. "I told them everything. You can finally rest now." But even as he said the words, he knew peace wouldn't come easily, not for him, not for Victor, not for Mitch. Then came the moment no one expected. A week after the revelation, Victor showed up at Mitch's doorstep. It was late, and the city lights outside cast long shadows across the room. Mitch opened the door reluctantly, his face hard with resentment. "You have nerve showing up here," he said coldly. Victor didn't flinch. "I didn't come here to fight," he replied. "I came here to talk, to try to understand the son I never knew." Mitch laughed bitterly. "You want to understand me now? After ignoring my existence for decades?" He stepped aside reluctantly, allowing Victor in, but the tension was suffocating. Victor looked around the penthouse, his gaze settling on the walls filled with photographs of Mitch's accomplishments, awards, family pictures, memories of a life Victor had missed. "You built all this yourself," Victor said quietly, almost admiringly. "You didn't need anyone." Mitch turned sharply. "No thanks to you. You abandoned my mother, remember? You left her to die alone while you built your empire." Victor's eyes softened, but the guilt was undeniable. "I was young, arrogant," he said. "I made choices I can't take back. But I didn't know about you until it was too late." Mitch's laugh was hollow. "Too late? That's convenient. You always have a way of rewriting the story so you come out clean." The silence that followed was brutal. For a moment, Victor looked like he might walk out, but then something broke in him. He turned toward Mitch, his voice trembling. "You think I don't regret it? Every day, I think about the people I've hurt, the children I've failed. But you were taken from me before I even had a chance." He paused, his hand gripping the back of a chair for balance. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect understanding. But I want the truth between us, not the lies that Holden or anyone else told." Mitch's anger flickered into uncertainty. He could see the sincerity in Victor's eyes, but years of resentment wouldn't dissolve overnight. "The truth," he said bitterly, "is that I spent my life trying not to become you. And now, I find out I already am." Victor looked away, the words cutting deeper than any corporate betrayal ever had. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," he said quietly. "You've built something strong, something I'm proud of. Even if I had nothing to do with it." Mitch's expression softened just slightly, the first crack in the wall he'd built around himself. "Pride doesn't erase abandonment," he said. "You can't just show up and fix it with words." "No," Victor replied, "but it's a start." In the following days, the two men began to cross paths more often, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident. There were no apologies yet, no reconciliation. But there was something new, acknowledgement. At Newman Enterprises, when Mitch entered a board meeting, Victor no longer looked at him as an outsider. Their conversations were sharp but layered with unspoken emotion. It was as if both were testing the boundaries of a fragile new reality. "You've got your mother's fire," Victor told him during one tense exchange. "But my temper," Mitch replied dryly. For the first time, Victor smiled. It was small, but it was real. Holden, watching from a distance, was relieved to see even a glimmer of understanding forming between them. Yet he knew the damage he'd done couldn't be undone so easily. Victor still hadn't forgiven him for keeping the secret, and Mitch had stopped speaking to him altogether. One afternoon, Holden found himself standing outside Newman Towers, watching the building that had become a symbol of both his greatest achievement and his greatest sin. He thought of leaving Genoa City for good, but part of him wanted to stay, to make things right, if such a thing was still possible. That chance came unexpectedly. Nikki tracked Holden down, her expression somewhere between pity and fury. "You broke this family," she said coldly. "But maybe you can help mend it." She explained that Mitch had been spiraling emotionally, driven by anger, guilt, and confusion. Victor was trying, but every attempt to connect seemed to push Mitch further away. "He doesn't trust anyone," Nikki said softly. "Least of all Victor. But he might still listen to you." Holden hesitated. "He won't," he said. "He hates me." "Maybe," Nikki replied. "But he still needs answers only you can give." That night, Holden went to see Mitch. The younger man opened the door, his face weary but alert. "You've got 5 minutes," he said sharply. Holden nodded. "That's all I need." He stepped inside, holding a small envelope. "These belong to your mother," he said. "Letters she wrote before she died. She wanted you to know who your father was, but I stopped her. I thought I was protecting you." Mitch froze, his eyes locked on the envelope. "Why are you giving me this now?" Holden sighed. "Because you deserve to know her truth, not mine, not Victor's. Hers." He handed the letters over and turned to leave, but Mitch stopped him. "Why did you wait so long?" Holden looked back, eyes filled with remorse. "Because I was a coward. Because I thought keeping the secret would spare everyone pain. But I was wrong." Then, quietly, he added, "I loved you like a son. That's why it hurt too much to tell you." Mitch said nothing as Holden left. But when he opened the letters later that night, tears filled his eyes. Margaret's words were tender, full of hope and heartbreak. She had written about Victor, not as a monster, but as a man who had once loved her deeply, even if his ambition tore them apart. She had written about her dreams for Mitch, her belief that one day he would find his place in the world. And she had written, heartbreakingly, "If you ever meet your father, don't hate him. Love him enough for both of us." Those words shattered Mitch's defenses. For the first time, he saw his father not as a villain, but as a man haunted by his own flaws. The next morning, Mitch showed up at the ranch. Victor was sitting on the terrace, drinking coffee, staring out over the property. When he saw Mitch, he stood up immediately. "I didn't think you'd come," he said softly. "Neither did I," Mitch replied. There was a long silence before Mitch placed the letters on the table. "I read these last night," he said. "They were from my mother." Victor hesitated, then opened one. His eyes moved over Margaret's familiar handwriting, and for a moment, his face softened completely. "She never stopped loving you," Mitch said quietly. Victor swallowed hard. "And I never stopped regretting losing her."